Kang Mayan looked at Jungkook coldly as the priest asked her to repeat the vows after him. Kang Mayan didn't want to say anything. She wanted to say no, but she knew that it would hurt her family more than her mother, whom she loved the most. With that, Jungkook slid the ring into her finger with a satisfied expression. The priest smiled happily and pronounced them husband-wife. Vine was so shocked. It had only been a couple of weeks since she became engaged to Jungkook. Her whole world changed after he wanted to marry her. Jungkook came near her and kissed her forehead, causing her to close her eyes in anger. As the car stopped in front of the big mansion, Vian came out of her thoughts, which were telling her to run away from everyone and everything. She nodded without caring to look at him and got out of the car. Jungkook was shocked at first but shrugged off all his negative thoughts. He looked proud of his house. It was huge. It was very modern and luxurious. Jungkook walked closer to her and hugged her from behind, making her whole body froze in his touch. She sat and pulled out of his hold before heading to the bathroom. Jungkook sighed and looked down. He murmured he felt guilty for touching her without her permission. Vine rested her head on the headboard of the bed. She sighed, thinking about the past events which made her feel disgusted by being touched by anyone. She hated when someone touched her or tried to get close to her. She was afraid of people, and if they wanted something, she could not give it to them. She hated her life. She was always alone, even though she had her mother who took care of her. Everything was in her life, making her life live in hell. She was lonely, but she couldn't find a way to express it. She just wanted to run away from her pain and never see it again. The thought of her life alone was unbearable. Jungkook asked as he came out of the bathroom after taking a shower. He was shirtless, drying his hair with the towel. Ryan didn't give him the attention which he was craving for. He felt a sting inside. Ryan turned around to face him, but then she remembered why she wanted to avoid him so much. She didn't know how to express herself properly. He might be understood if she tried to speak to him. He sat and left the room before taking his laptop with him. While tapping on the laptop, Junko's mind was only stuck on Ryan. All he wanted to see her smile and happy with him. He didn't even know why she was so cold towards him. He never experienced that kind of feeling in his life as he was the most heartless mafia boss, but still felt weak in front of that girl who was now his wife. Maybe he should change his way and start showing affection to her. Maybe he should try to make up with her. Maybe he should ask her what happened before he met her. He whispered to himself. Vine sat on the chair for breakfast. Jungkook glanced at her and smiled, seeing her confused and calm as always. He said, causing her to look at him. She nodded her head, didn't say a word, which made Jungkook hurt inside. All he wanted to hear was her voice. He decided to change the subject and asked her. Vian looked at him confused. How did he know she wrote? Her voice came out whispering. It was so low but not unheard by Jungkook. Jungkook smiled brightly. She nodded her head and started to eat quietly when the maid served her. After a few minutes, Jungkook spoke again. He said sweetly, Jungkook could feel warmth spreading in his stomach while he was looking at Vian. She muttered to herself and resumed eating silently. He answered while staring at her. Vian stopped eating and looked at him with the most cold expression. She completed her words and waited for Jungkook to say something, but he didn't because he was so stunned to speak. Vian looked away and sighed deeply before getting up and left him alone. He wondered as he watched her leave. Why would she behave in a such way towards him? Why would she think he didn't care? He cared a lot for her. He couldn't stop thinking about her and wondering if maybe she was suffering alone. Vine groaned and sat straight on the bed after having a nice sleep. She looked around and didn't find Jungkook, which made her frown. It's been 2 weeks living with Jungkook, and he was always nice with her, even though she never did the same with him, but still he never misses the chance to talk to with her. She sighed again and got up from the bed. She took a shower and got ready before going out of the room. Once she entered the living room, her eyes were searching for Jungkook. She really wanted to see him. She frowned when she didn't find him anywhere. Vian looked at her and shook her head. She asked, her voice almost whispering. She smiled at her. Vian shook her head. The maid nodded her head and walked to the kitchen. She muttered to herself and sat down on the couch. Vian sighed, resting her back on the backrest. It had been 2 days and Vine still didn't see him anywhere. Whenever she asked the maid, she always told her that he was busy with work. Every day she hoped Jungkook was going to appear, but it was clear that was impossible. Vine was sitting on the couch in the living room waiting for Jungkook at midnight. She wanted to talk to him and asked him if he was okay or not. She heard some noises coming from outside the door and waited. Soon the door opened, revealing Jungkook in a mess. He was injured and blood was dripping from his wounds. She ran to him and saw the cut on his cheekbone and had dried blood in his forehead. Vian sighed and held his arm, making him look at her confused. She helped him to sit on the couch and went to grab the first aid kit. Jungkook didn't say a word all the while as he just watched her. She came in front of him and stood. Jungkook held her hand, stopping her from moving closer. She frowned a little at his action. He pulled her on his lap harshly, making her gasp harder. Her heartbeat increased. Jungkook could feel it, and he knew she could feel his. His eyes locked with hers, both of them breathing heavily. She murmured as she tried to focus her breathing. She looked at his beautiful face and then focused on his bleeding cut. She whispered while treating his wounds. Jungkook felt happy that she cared about him. This is the first time she was talking more than before. Jungkook looked up at her to see her concentrating and caring about him. She looked beautiful, he thought. Her beauty made his heart beat faster. She said she had finished treating his wound and put bandage over them. She sat and got off from his lap. Jungkook didn't move, he just watched her. He had a very cute nose and lip. She was beautiful. Jungkook had never felt this way. He was in love with her. Jungkook stood up from the couch slowly and took a few steps towards Vian, who looked at him. Her eyes filled with tears. He whispered softly. And she began to tell everything that happened in her life. She closed her eyes and clenched his face, trying to get rid of the sadness inside of her. But there was nothing inside of her except pain and sadness. Jungkook wanted to hug her, she wanted to kiss her tear that formed in her cheek, but he knew she needed some time. She looked at him, he was looking at her with full attention. She took a deep breath and opened her eyes. Jungkook had a sad expression on his face. Jungkook took his step closer to her and hugged her tightly. He whispered in her ear soothingly. She returned his hug and closed her eyes, enjoying his warmth. Her body felt relaxed, everything around her seemed to disappear. All of a sudden, she found herself crying into his chest. She nodded her head, she pulled apart from him and smiled weakly. She said with a warm smile, and Jungkook took his pillow and was about to go to the couch. Jungkook nodded his head and climbed on the bed. Wyan smiled and laid beside him. He spoke with a sleepy voice, making Wyan turn to look at him. He asked, looking straight into her eyes. Jungkook leaned to her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her closer to him. He felt relief. He could finally feel her warmth, and his heart was beating fast in his chest. He buried his nose in her neck and inhaled her scent. Vian was feeling the same way. She closed her eyes when he kissed the place where her neck and shoulder met, and she felt herself shiver. She shuddered. Jungkook looked into her eyes and smiled. She whispered. He replied with the equally soft tone. After a few days, Vian started to talk with Jungkook a bit comfortably. She was trying her best to show him that she cared about him and wanted to give this relationship a chance. There are some more things which she hasn't told Jungkook about yet because she needed some time to build trust in him. Jungkook stared at her while she was applying the lip balm on her lips. Drowning in a deep thought, Jungkook smiled and made his way towards her as he was standing in the doorway admiring her beauty. Wang looked at him through the mirror and frowned. He nodded when he stood behind her, made her look at him. He said, and she reached into the drawer and got out of a box. She gave him a tube of lip balm, then looked down at the ground. Janko chuckled softly and held her chin between his finger and thumb, lifting her gaze to meet his eyes again. Janko gently placed his lips on her, kissing her to clinch his shirt. He didn't kiss her nor move away, he was just placing his lip on her. After a few seconds, he moved back and smiled. He smiled as he saw her blush slightly and looked away in embarrassment. Janko smiled while reading Vian's novel. He smiled, placed the book at the nightstand, turned his body to look at her sitting on the opposite side of the bed. The moonlight was shining through the window, making the environment more calm. Ryan looked at him and smiled. She said softly. He grinned widely. She smiled. He stated softly and sat on the edge of the bed next to her. Ryan moved her hand to hold his hand softly. He said softly, looking directly into her eyes. She replied. Jungkook chuckled and caressed her finger gently. He asked. She sighed softly, then continued. She whispered. He smiled, encouraging her. Ryan nodded her head and squeezed Jungkook's hand softly. Jungkook hugged his mother while Ryan bowed at her. She was comfortable with Jungkook but not with anyone. She said and hugged her tightly, making Ryan feel warm inside for belonging to the family. Mrs. Jun slowly let go of her and smiled at her, making her smile. He assured her, making Ryan nodded her head nervously. Mr. Jun walked closer to the three of them along with his older son. He smiled at her. She said awkwardly, smiling at him, guessing everyone to smile. She sat and hugged her once again, making Ryan to let out a small chuckle. Ryan looked at him with sparkling eyes after hearing his word. He smiled at her and stroked her cheek. Ryan felt warm inside knowing she has someone who cares about her. Jungkook and Ryan entered the mansion after having a dinner with his family. She was feeling happy and overwhelmed by their behavior. No one ever accepted her like they did. Even her own family never treated her that good. Now she couldn't control herself. Ryan sighed and looked at Jungkook. His back was facing her. He was about to walk but stopped when Ryan called him. He turned around with a confused expression. She blurted out. He looked at her with wide eyes, shocked with what he said. He gulped. Did I hear correctly? He wasn't sure if it was really happening or it's just his mind playing tricks with him. He stuttered, his eyes filled with hope and surprise. She whispered shyly. She said louder this time. Vi nodded her head and Jungkook immediately ran to her and hugged her tightly. They both hugged each other tightly and laughed with joy and happiness. Vi couldn't help but smile widely as he rubbed his face in her neck. After a few moments, Jungkook loosened himself from her embrace and cupped her cheeks in his palms. His voice was shaking and Vine smiled at him. She smiled, making him nod his head. Vine placed her lips on Jungkook's. He smiled and started kissing her. It was sweet kiss full of emotion, passion and love. He chuckled and pulled her close to him. Vine smiled and rested her forehead against his chest. Jungkook smiled and wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her even closer. She said with the bright eyes. Jungkook looked at her lovingly with a soft smile on his face. She smiled, making Jungkook proud of himself to be her husband. She was so passionate, and in those few months, Jungkook got to know more about her. She said when she came in front of him, Jungkook came out of his deep thoughts and hugged her. He sat and kissed the top off her head. She smiled and pulled away. She smiled, he nodded his head and grabbed her hand.